If you were asked right now to prove that the Roman Empire existed, you wouldn't really have to look very hard.
No.
Definitely not. You just point to the Colosseum or, the aqueducts, the marble ruins.
With the statues.
Exactly. The statues, the massive libraries filled with those meticulous scrolls. I mean, when we think about how a civilization remembers its past, we expect a paper trail.
Right, a physical paper trail.
Yeah. We expect history to be, well, visible, carved into stone, tangible, neatly categorized by guys in togas.
It's a very comforting assumption, honestly. We like to think that history is just this thing you can hold in your hands.
Right.
Like it's something that has been deliberately cataloged from day one by men sitting in grand institutions.
But, and this is where today's deep dive begins, if you step into the world of early Islamic historiography...
And jurisprudence.
Yes, and jurisprudence, that entire physical paper trail, it just kind of vanishes into the desert wind.
It really does. You are looking at a historical landscape that is, for all intents and purposes, just a blank slate.
A completely blank slate. Yet, out of that seemingly empty desert came a system of historical verification that was so intense, so intellectually rigorous, that it actually rivals modern academic peer review.
Oh, absolutely.
And today, our mission is to basically extract the ultimate aha moments from how early Muslims revolutionized the way humanity records history.
And creates laws.
Right. We are going to explore how a religious awakening completely transformed a society that essentially had zero concept of history
None at all.
into a civilization that pioneered historical objectivity.
And we're going to see how that exact same obsession with truth didn't just stop at, recording the past.
Yeah.
It bled directly into how they govern the press.
Which is the fascinating part.
It is. We'll be unpacking how this intellectual rigor birthed a legal system that introduced concepts like intent, social insurance, and international law centuries before the modern world caught up to them.
Centuries. So despite the incredibly dense academic nature of the historical texts we are diving into today, this isn't just some dry recounting of dates and facts. Far from it.
It's a journey into the human mind. It's a story about how we decide what's true, how we determine what's good, and how we figure out how to govern ourselves without just completely drowning in our own biases.
Which is a very modern problem, too.
Seriously. So let's start by painting a picture of the baseline. Before this massive transformation we're talking about, what did the Arabian Peninsula actually look like in terms of, historical record keeping?
I mean, the baseline is essentially zero.
Zero.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
We have to look at the nomadic culture of pre-Islamic Arabia.
Okay.
The economic and cultural realities of that environment were entirely focused on survival.
Right, because of the harsh desert environment.
Exactly. You don't build massive archives or fund a whole class of professional historians when your primary concern is just finding the next oasis.
Or not dying of thirst.
Or defending your tribe from a raid. They just didn't have those sweeping epics like the Greeks or the monumental annals like the Romans.
So what did they have? Just oral traditions. Yeah, but hyper-localized oral traditions.
Yeah.
The texts describe their primary method of remembering the past as being totally focused on genealogies and something called battle days.
Battle days. That's a fascinating term because when you read about it, it feels very disconnected.
Highly disconnected.
Like they would remember a specific fight. Maybe they'd compose a really dramatic poem about it, use it to brag around the fire, and that was it.
That was literally it. The term used in the literature is khabar.
Khabar.
Right. In its singular form, it translates roughly to a report or an item of news.
Just a single item.
Yeah, a single vivid anecdote. Let's say a tribe inflicted this humiliating defeat on a rival.
Okay.
They would remember that specific battle day. They would craft poetry to give it dramatic flair, really preserving the emotional high of the victory.
But that's not history.
No, it wasn't history in any analytical sense. It was just a disconnected, self-contained story.
I want to frame this in a way that makes sense for you listening today. To me, this whole pre-Islamic oral tradition sounds exactly like stumbling across a disconnected social media post from 10 years ago.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it.
Right. Like, imagine you find a single photo of a protest or a really sharp, witty tweet about some political event, but you have no timeline.
No context.
No context at all. No trending topics, no algorithm feeding you the buildup. It's just this fragmented moment in time.
Yeah.
There's no overarching narrative connecting that post to what happened a week before or, a year later.
Exactly. Each khabar stood completely isolated. The tribes weren't looking looking for the interaction of events.
They weren't connecting the dots.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They weren't asking the crucial analytical questions like, how did this battle over grazing rights 10 years ago trigger the economic collapse of our rival today?
Right, the cause and effect.
The concept of a connected sequence of events, which is actually what the plural term Akbar eventually came to mean under Islam, was just completely alien to them. Even the word they eventually adopted for history, tarikh, seems to have originally just meant assigning a date to a commercial transaction.
So Tariq just meant dating a receipt.
Basically, yeah. It wasn't about the grand story of human progress.
Okay, so how do you leap from bragging about a sword fight in an isolated poem to compiling massive, analytical, multi-volume historical records?
That is the big question.
Because the sources are adamant that the catalyst wasn't a sudden influx of wealth or like a technological breakthrough. They say it was entirely religious.
It was a fundamental cognitive shift driven by theology. And it all begins with the structure of the Quran.
Okay, walk us through how that actually works in practice. How does a religious text force a nomadic society to suddenly become historians?
Well, the Quran doesn't just present a list of arbitrary rules or disconnected fables. It introduces a very specific, continuous historical framework.
Continuous being the key word.
Exactly. It uses history as an empirical moral argument.
How?
The text repeatedly points its listeners to past ruined cities and civilizations, like the people of Ad or the people of Thamud.
Just pointing out old ruins.
But it doesn't just say, look, these ruins, aren't they spooky? It actively challenges the reader's intellect. It says, investigate what happened to them.
Oh, like go figure out why they are ruined.
Right. The underlying premise is that human actions have continuous logical consequences.
Okay, so if a past society acted a certain way,
If they acted with extreme arrogance, hoarded wealth, oppressed the vulnerable, and they were subsequently destroyed, the Quran uses that historical data point to argue that the universe is wired a certain way.
it's a warning.
It tells the listener, learn from the experience of others, because the rules that apply to them apply to you.
It turns history into data.
Exactly.
It's not just a cool story anymore, it's an empirical proof. It's basically saying if you input X behavior into a society, Y destruction will eventually output.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But wait, I have to challenge this premise for a second. Because the Arabian Peninsula wasn't existing in a vacuum.
Sure.
You had the Byzantine Empire to the northwest, the Sassanid Persian Empire to the northeast.
Huge empires.
Right. You had the Greeks, the Romans, the Hindus, all within trading distance or historical memory. Surely the Arabs just bumped into these established civilizations, saw them writing history, and, I don't know, decided to copy them.
It's the most natural assumption to make. I mean, everyone thinks that. But the historiographical evidence completely refutes it.
Really? Completely?
Completely. Let's look at the neighbors. First, the classical Greek histories, the works of Herodotus or Thucydides, were entirely lost to the early Arabs.
They just didn't have access to them.
They didn't. And interestingly, even to the later Greeks and Romans, history wasn't considered a major science.
It wasn't.
No, it wasn't part of their core curriculum. When the Muslims eventually began translating Greek works during the Abbasid period, they eagerly translated Greek medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy.
The hard sciences.
Yeah, but they largely ignored Greek history.
Wow. Okay, what about the Persians or the Hindus? The Persian Empire was massive and highly bureaucratic.
The Hindu civilization, as noted by scholars of the time, never developed a strong chronological interest in history. Their worldview was much more cyclical and mythological.
Okay.
As for the Iranians, they certainly loved to glorify their past, but their records relied heavily on myth and legend.
So not hard facts.
Right. Think of the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings.
Oh, I've heard of that.
It's a brilliant epic, but it's not sober analytical history. It's filled with demons and heroes living for hundreds of years.
Definitely not peer-reviewed history.
Exactly. The early Muslims needed something much more rigorous. The text emphasized that outside influence was, at best, negligible.
So they didn't copy anyone.
They might have picked up a few minor bureaucratic techniques for dating documents, but the core driving force of their historical consciousness came entirely from within their new theology.
And this hinges on a very specific theological concept about the Prophet Muhammad, doesn't it? The concept of him being the seal of the prophets.
Yes.
I want to dig into the psychology of this because I think it's the key to everything we are discussing today.
It is the absolute cornerstone. In Islamic theology, Muhammad is viewed as standing at the watershed of time.
The watershed.
The belief is that previous prophets were sent to specific tribes or nations for specific eras.
Okay.
But Muhammad's message was the final one, meant for all of humanity for the rest of time. He is the seal. There are no more prophets coming.
Meaning there are no more updates coming to the system.
None.
You have the final software patch, and if you lose it or if you let it get corrupted, there's no divine IT department coming down to reinstall it for you.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And that realization creates an immense, almost crushing psychological burden on the community.
I can imagine.
Because if this is the final message, it has to be preserved perfectly. Contrast this with, say, the early Christian view of history.
Okay, let's contrast it.
In early Christian dogma, Christ is the man-God who stepped into history to redeem the world. Once the crucifixion and resurrection occurred, the ultimate goal of history was achieved.
Right. If you believe the world has been redeemed and you are just waiting for the apocalypse, which, many early Christians believed was imminent, you don't bother setting up a massive institutional framework to record what happened last Tuesday.
Exactly.
Why write history if the world is ending tomorrow?
The eschatological focus of early Christianity made detailed historical recording seem somewhat trivial, but the Muslim position was fundamentally different.
Because they had a different mandate.
Right. The Quran enjoined them to be a community that actively builds a just society, preaches the truth, and sets an example for the world.
In this world.
Yes. If there are no more prophets coming to correct them when they go astray, the mission has to be carried forward by scholars, jurists, and historians.
They become the guardians.
To do that, they had to rigorously document the past. They had to know exactly what the prophet said, exactly what he did, and exactly what happened to previous civilizations so they could understand and execute the divine plan.
So we've seen how this theological concept of finality forced them to care about the past.
Right.
But that brings up a massive problem. I mean, if your entire motivation to record history is religious, if you believe your eternal salvation depends on getting the facts right, how do you make sure you aren't just writing religious fan fiction?
It's a huge risk.
Because we know human nature. People love to exaggerate.
They do.
People love to make their heroes look better or invent quotes that support their own political views. How do you prevent pious people from just, making things up out of love for their religion?
This is where we transition into one of the most intellectually rigorous systems of antiquity, the science of hadith.
The science of hadith. Let's unpack this.
So hadith refers to the sayings, actions, and silent approvals of the prophet. Because his life was the ultimate model for behavior, the early Muslims eagerly collected every single detail about him.
Which makes sense.
Now, while he was alive, or while his immediate companions were alive, verification was relatively easy. You just walked up to someone who was there and asked them.
Right. Hey, did he actually say this?
Exactly. But time passes,
Yeah.
people die, the community expands from Arabia all the way to Spain and India.
That's a massive geographic spread.
Suddenly you are 3, 4, 5 generations removed from the source. It turns into the ultimate high-stakes game of telephone.
And we all know how the game of telephone ends.
Badly. And the Muslim scholars were acutely aware of this danger. They realized that distance in time and geography breeds fabrication.
So what do?
They developed an incredibly stringent dual method of verification to audit these historical reports. The two pillars of the system are Rawaya and Diraya.
Relia and Diraya. I want to spend some real time here because throwing around Arabic terminology can get overwhelming really fast.
It can, yeah.
Let's actually demonstrate how this works. Let's build a mock scenario.
Okay, let's do it.
Suppose I'm a scholar living in Baghdad 100 years after the Prophet, and someone comes to me and says, "Hey, I heard a report that the Prophet said it is an absolute sin to eat apples."
The forbidden apple rule.
Exactly. How do I use Rawaya and Diraya to prove this guy is lying? Let's start with Rawaya.
So Rawaya is the uninterrupted chain of transmission. It is the genealogical tree of the information.
The tree, okay.
You wouldn't just look at the guy and say, "I don't believe you." You would demand his chain. You would say, "Who exactly did you hear this from?"
Give me your sources.
Right. And he would have to say, "I heard it from John." And you would ask, "And who did John hear it from?"
And he'd say, "John heard it from David."
Exactly. John heard it from David, who heard it from a companion of the prophet, who heard it directly from the prophet.
Okay, so I have this list of names, but I mean, a list of names is just a list.
It is.
If I'm a clever liar, I know all the famous scholars. I can just invent a really convincing chain. I can just say, Oh, I heard it from the greatest scholar in Medina who heard it from the Prophet's best friend.
Of course.
I can slap a realistic-looking chain of transmission onto my fake Apple rule to make it look totally legitimate. How does Riwayah stop me from doing that?
That is the exact vulnerability the scholars anticipated.
Okay.
And their solution was to invent an entirely new, massive subgenre of history called Ilm al-Rihal,
Ilm alihal.
which translates to the knowledge of men, or basically biographical dictionaries. They didn't just accept the names, they compiled exhaustive working biographies of thousands upon thousands of narrators.
We became background checkers.
The ultimate background checker.
What kind of background checks are we talking about here?
Intensive, almost invasive scrutiny of a person's life. If you gave me your chain U to John, to David, I would go to my biographical dictionary and look up John. When was John born? When did he die? Where did he travel?
Wow, tracking their movements.
Did John actually live in the same city at the same time as David?
Oh.
Right. If the records show John died in Egypt in the year 700, but David didn't visit Egypt until 705, the chain is broken.
Busted.
Exactly. John could not possibly have heard this from David.
So they're cross-referencing dates of birth, death, and travel itineraries just to make sure a physical meeting was even geographically possible.
Yes, precisely.
That's incredible. But what if they did live in the same city? What if John and David were neighbors?
Then they moved to evaluating character and competence.
Character.
Did John have a reputation for having a sharp memory? Or did he become senile in his old age?
They tracked cognitive decline.
They absolutely did. Did he write things down or just rely on memory? Most importantly, was he ever caught in a lie?
And I bet it didn't even have to be a big religious lie.
It didn't. If John was known to cheat his customers in the marketplace or even exaggerate stories for entertainment, he was branded as unreliable.
Just for exaggerating at a party.
Yes. Any report flowing through him was flagged, treated with extreme caution, or just entirely discarded.
So that's Riwayah, the external audit of the chain. But what if the chain is flawless?
Okay.
What if every person in the chain is known to be a paragon of truth with perfect memories and they all lived in the right places at the right times? But the report itself is still my fake rule about apples being a sin.
That is where the second pillar, Diraya, comes in.
Uriah.
Diraya is the internal scrutiny of the text itself. The scholars established rules of logic and textual consistency. First, does this report contradict the Quran?
Well, the Quran doesn't forbid apples.
Right, and it explicitly says God has made good foods permissible. Therefore, your report contradicts a higher established truth.
So it's thrown out.
Thrown out.
Yeah.
Second, does it contradict established historical facts or basic human reason? Even if the chain of people looks impeccable, if the content is absurd, contradictory, or clearly fabricated to support a modern political faction, the text is rejected.
The sources provide a phenomenal specific example of this chain of transmission in action. It really highlights how meticulous the system was. Let's trace it.
Let's do it.
It starts with one of the most famous compilers in Islamic history, a man named al-Bukhari.
Right. Al-Bukhari wanted to record a specific saying to prove its authenticity. He couldn't just write it down. He had to cite his sources meticulously.
Show his work.
Yes. So in his massive compilation, he records, I received this from Ibn Hanbal, who heard it from Abd al-Razak, who heard it from Ammar, who heard it from Hammam, who heard it from Abu Huraira, who heard it directly from the Prophet.
Now, to you and me, listening to that just sounds like a confusing phone book.
It really does.
It's just a string of Arabic names. But to an early historian, this was a cryptographic key. And here is where it gets absolutely mind-blowing.
This is the best part.
Modern researchers today actually have access to the physical texts written by some of these earlier guys in the chain.
We do.
We don't just have to take al-Bukhari's word for it that Ibn Hanbal told him this. We actually possess the book written by his source, Ibn Hanbal.
Yes.
And if you open Ibn Hanbal's book, he has the exact same quote citing the exact same people before him.
And the archaeological evidence goes even deeper.
Yeah.
We also have the book compiled by Ibn Hanbal's source, Abd al-Razak.
Really?
It was edited and published relatively recently. If you look in that manuscript, the exact same text is there with the remaining chain.
So it matches perfectly.
Perfectly. We even have the book from Ammar. And remarkably, incredibly, we possess the original physical notebook dictated by Abu Huraira to his pupil Hammam.
The guy at the very beginning of the chain.
Yes. At every single step backwards through centuries of documentation, the text remains identical.
That is just staggering.
It is a stunning empirical validation of their methodology. They weren't just guessing, they were preserving data with a fidelity that is almost hard to comprehend in the pre-digital age.
It's like finding the original handwritten receipts for a transaction made 1,000 years ago across 5 different banks.
Exactly.
But I still want to push back on human nature here.
Okay, push back.
Because even with biographical dictionaries, even with cross-referencing, humans are still humans.
We are.
People have biases. Why wouldn't a historian just subtly twist the truth to favor their political patron or their own sect? If the caliph is paying your salary, you're going to write history that makes the caliph look good.
This is where we have to re-inject the religious motivation into the equation.
Right, the fear factor.
For these early scholars, writing history was not a secular profession. They viewed objectivity as a literal act of worship.
The literal act of worship.
They deeply, profoundly believed they would face divine judgment on the day of resurrection for falsifying history.
That's a heavy burden.
The prophet had strictly, unequivocally forbidden ascribing a false saying to him, promising hellfire to anyone who did. So the historian felt bound by the ethics of a judge sitting in a cosmic courtroom.
Wow.
If selfish motives, greed, or political bias interfered with their work, all spiritual merit was lost. They would be condemning their own souls.
The fear of God was their peer review.
It really was.
It wasn't just about losing tenure at a university, it was about eternal damnation.
Exactly. And the literature gives a fascinating, tangible example of this from the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent involving a historian named Badayuni and the famous Emperor Akbar.
Yes, I love this story because it perfectly encapsulates how this fear of God actually altered the way a historian wrote. Set the stage for us with Emperor Akbar and Badayuni.
So Emperor Akbar was a massively powerful monarch of the Mughal Empire.
Okay.
He was known for having a very heterodox approach to religion, attempting to synthesize different faiths, which deeply upset Orthodox Muslim scholars like Badayuni.
Badayuni was not a fan.
Not at all. Badayuni wrote a history book called Muntakab al-Tawarikh. His primary motivation for writing this book seems to have been to prove to the world and to future generations that Akbar had strayed from the right path.
He wanted to ruin him historically.
He secretly despised Akbar's religious policies. He hated the man.
So if you hate the emperor, and you are writing a book specifically to tear down his legacy, you would expect Badayuni to just write a hit piece.
A total smear campaign.
Yeah. Filled with exaggerated lies about how terrible the emperor was, you'd expect him to write, "The emperor ate babies and burned down mosques for fun."
But he didn't.
He didn't.
And that is the brilliance of this example, because Badayuni was, first and foremost, a pious Orthodox Muslim. His intense fear of divine accountability forced him to write the literal truth.
Even though he hated the guy.
He couldn't bring himself to invent fake events or fabricate quotes because he truly believed God would punish him for lying, even if he was lying about a heretic.
So how did he express his deep hatred for the emperor without actually lying?
He became an absolute master of studied ambiguity and innuendo.
I love that. Studied ambiguity.
He would report the absolute, verifiable facts. But if there was a malicious rumor circulating that made Akbar look terrible, Badayuni wouldn't state it as a historical fact.
What would he do?
Instead, he would use distancing phrases like, "It is reported by some that," or "God alone knows the truth of this matter, but people say."
Ah, so he gives you the rumor but washes his hands of the lie.
Exactly. He would craft sentences that could be translated in multiple ways. He resorted to throwing subtle shade rather than outright fiction.
He was being passive-aggressive.
Highly passive-aggressive. His regard for the literal truth was so overpowering that even in a book meant to be a vicious takedown of his greatest enemy, he refused to mutilate the facts.
That is wild. The idea that a historian would rather use passive-aggressive grammar and complex syntax than actually lie, all because they are terrified of a cosmic audit.
A cosmic audit, that's exactly what it was.
It shows how deeply this obsession with objectivity permeated the culture. And they applied this exact same obsessive preservation to the text of the Quran itself, didn't they?
Yes. The Muslims believe the Quran is verbally sacred, the exact, unadulterated word of God.
Okay.
And the Quran itself teaches that previous scriptures from other prophets were corrupted over time by human interpolations, mistranslations, and political changes.
So they were on high alert.
High alert. So the early Muslim community was absolutely determined not to let that happen to their book. They instituted a double method of preservation.
What was the double method?
First, they wrote it down immediately. Second, they had thousands of people memorize it word for word, syllable for syllable.
Yeah.
This created a cultural reverence for the integrity of texts.
It's like having a physical hard drive and a massive decentralized cloud backup operating simultaneously.
That's exactly what it is.
If a scribe made a transcription error on the parchment, the thousands of memorizers would catch it instantly.
Right.
If a memorizer forgot a word, the written text was there to correct them.
Precisely. And you can see how that reverence for the accurate preservation of a religious text naturally spilled over.
It trained their brains.
Once a society develops the intellectual tools to perfectly preserve a holy book, they use those same tools to handle secular historical documents, state records, and complex legal contracts.
Okay, so we've established how they figured out what was true in the past.
Yes.
They used chains of transmission, biographical background checks, and the fear of God to verify facts. But history is just what happened.
Right.
Law is about what should happen. Knowing that a battle took place doesn't tell you if the war was just.
No, they didn't.
Knowing that a man sold a camel doesn't tell you if the contract was fair. How do you go from verifying facts to determining rules?
That is the leap to jurisprudence.
I want to shift our focus now to jurisprudence, what is known as Fiqh. Because if history requires objective truth, law requires objective morality.
Absolutely.
How did these early scholars figure out what was good and what was evil?
That question sits at the very core of Islamic legal philosophy. The sources explained that for the early Muslims, the rules of conduct weren't just seen as arbitrary tests of loyalty from a dictatorial god.
So it wasn't just do this because I said so.
Exactly. A highly influential group of early rationalist theologians and jurists, known as the Mu'tazilites, were struck by how often the Quran appealed directly to human reason.
Human reason.
The text doesn't just demand blind obedience. It constantly uses terms like maruf and munkar.
Let's define those terms because they seem foundational to this whole legal structure.
Maruf translates to a good, which is inherently recognized as good by everyone, regardless of their religion.
Like universal good.
Right. Honesty, charity, justice. These are maruf. And munkar is an evil that is naturally, instinctively disapproved of by human nature.
Like murder or theft.
Murder, theft, oppression. The Mu'tazilites argued that laws are based on the inherent good or the inherent evil residing within a given act. God doesn't just arbitrarily say, do this because I am powerful and I said so. He says, do this because it is inherently good for your soul and your society.
So morality isn't just a divine dictatorship. It has a rational, objective foundation that human beings can actually perceive using their intellect.
That was the argument.
But I see a massive danger here. Human reason is incredibly fallible.
Oh, highly fallible.
We are remarkably good at rationalizing our way into terrible ideas. If we rely solely on what we think is logically good, we end up justifying all sorts of oppression.
We see that all through history.
Exactly. How did they balance this belief in human reason with the need for divine guidance?
That exact philosophical tension is perfectly captured in a famous, almost humorous anecdote about one of the greatest early legal minds in Islam, a jurist named Abu Hanifa.
The shoe analogy. I love this story because it brilliantly illustrates the limits of pure logic. Let me set this up for you.
Go for it.
Abu Hanifa was legendary for having a brilliant, penetrating, highly rational mind. But because he was so smart and relied heavily on logical deduction, some of the more strict literalist scholars in his era accused him of being a heretic.
They didn't trust his logic.
Right. They basically confronted him and said, you rely way too much on your own personal opinion and human logic. You are ignoring the sacred texts and the established practices of the prophet just to follow your own brain.
Right. The literalists believed that if you let human reason interpret the law too much, you inevitably corrupt the divine intent. They wanted strict adherence to the text, period.
So someone actually has the audacity to accuse Abu Hanifa of this to his face. And Abu Hanifa, who apparently had a razor-sharp wit, replies to the critic.
He had a great response.
He says, I never make up rules based on my personal opinion. I always follow the texts. In fact, if I relied solely on human logic, I would order people to wipe the soles of their shoes during the ritual ablution, rather than the uppers of their shoes.
It's a brilliant philosophical joke, but it contains a profound legal truth.
It really does, because think about it logically. Before Muslims pray, they perform an ablution, washing themselves.
Right.
If you are wearing leather socks or shoes, the practice is to wipe wet hands over them. Now, if human logic is your only guide, the bottom of the shoe is the part that touches the mud, the dirt, the street.
Exactly. That's the physically dirty part.
That's the part that needs washing. Logic dictates you wash the sole. But the Prophet's established practice was to wipe the top of the footwear.
Right.
So Abu Hanifa is telling his critic, look, I follow the divine text even when my narrow human logic tells me the exact opposite.
And what's fascinating here is what Abu Hanifa left unsaid. He didn't bother explaining to his critic why wiping the top of the shoe actually makes sense on a deeper level.
What's the deeper level?
Well, if you analyze it, as the source text points out, if you use water to moisten the dirty sole of your shoe and then you stand up to pray on a communal carpet or mat,
Oh, you just make mud.
you are just going to create mud and ruin the prayer space for everyone else.
Oh. So superficial human logic says, wash the physically dirty part. But a higher logic, a logic that looks at the actual consequences of the action on the community, says, don't make the bottom of your shoe wet before you walk on a rug.
Exactly. A single issue can have multiple conflicting aspects.
Wow.
It is the duty of the philosopher of law to give preference to the most important aspect.
Which you might not see right away.
Right. Human reason is absolutely vital for understanding the law, but it has limits.
Mm-hmm.
The divine text provides the ultimate anchor when human logic becomes too narrow or too focused on immediate variables.
Okay, so they are using the sophisticated blend of divine text and rational analysis of what is inherently good or evil.
Yes.
But how do they actually structure their laws on a day-to-day basis? Because real life isn't just black and white.
It's mostly gray.
Right. It's not just murder is bad and saving an orphan is good. There is a massive gray area in human behavior.
The early jurists realized that a binary legal system where everything is either mandatory or a crime would just crush society.
It would be suffocating.
How does a civilization function when it acknowledges that absolute unmixed good is incredibly rare in a messy relative world?
How does it?
The answer is that they built nuance and flexibility directly into their legal geometry. They developed a five-fold compass of Islamic law.
5 categories for every conceivable human action. Let's test this mechanism. I don't want to just list them. I want to see how this works in practice.
Let's do a case study.
Let's take something totally mundane. Let's take drinking a cup of coffee. Where does that fall?
That's a perfect example. Let's walk the compass. The baseline category, the middle ground, is indifferent or permissible. It's called mubah.
Mubah, so neutral.
Neutral. This is where the good and evil of an action are equal, or where the law simply sees no moral weight either way. It is left entirely to the discretion and free choice of the individual. Under normal circumstances, drinking a cup of coffee is simply mubah.
Okay, that's the gray area. What are the extremes, the black and white?
At one extreme, you have actions where the good is absolute and essential. These become obligatory, or wajib. If you don't do them, you are breaking the law and committing a sin. Conversely, at the other extreme, you have absolute, unmixed evil. These are prohibited, or haram.
Haram, we've heard that word. So how can my cup of coffee become obligatory or prohibited?
Let's say you are driving a long-distance bus full of passengers at night, and you are falling asleep at the wheel.
Sounds dangerous.
Very. The only thing keeping you awake to prevent a fatal crash is that cup of coffee. In that specific context, preserving human life is obligatory. So drinking the coffee becomes obligatory.
Wajib.
Oh, wow, the context flips it.
Exactly. On the flip side, what if that specific cup of coffee was stolen?
Then it's theft.
Right. Or what if a doctor has told you that due to a heart condition, drinking caffeine will trigger a lethal heart attack?
That's self-harm.
Yes. In those contexts, drinking it becomes an act of self-destruction or theft, moving it directly into the prohibited category, haram.
That makes total sense. The context completely dictates the ruling. But what about the spaces between the middle and the extremes? That's where the nuance really shines. If an action has a predominance of good, but isn't absolutely essential for survival, it is categorized as recommended, or mustahab.
Mustahab. So it's good, but not mandatory.
You get spiritual credit for doing it, but you aren't punished if you don't.
Yeah.
For instance, if you drink coffee to stay awake to study for a medical exam so you can help people, it might be recommended.
Okay.
The opposite of that is discouraged, or makruh.
Makruh.
This is an action that is predominantly bad, but not quite a mortal sin. It's better to avoid it, but doing it doesn't make you a criminal.
Give me an example for the coffee.
If drinking 5 cups of coffee makes you jittery and irritable with your family but doesn't actually kill you, a jurist might classify it as discouraged, makruh.
I see how brilliant this is. It means the law isn't just a blunt instrument.
Far from it.
It acknowledges that human actions are heavily dependent on context. It allows for different scholars to look at the same issue and arrive at slightly different conclusions without tearing the whole legal system apart.
Exactly, they can debate it.
One jurist might say eating a certain type of seafood is permissible, while another from a different region might say it's discouraged. The system absorbs these differences because they are debating within these intermediary, nuanced grades of good and evil, not arguing over the absolute foundations like murder or theft.
It creates a robust, highly flexible society that can adapt to different cultures, different geographies, and changing times without breaking its core moral compass.
But having a highly nuanced, five-fold legal compass is great in a university lecture hall. In the real world, laws only work if there is enforcement.
That's the reality.
Modern laws only work if the police actually catch you breaking them. If you run a red light in the middle of the night and no cameras are around, the state's law doesn't really stop you. How did early Islamic jurisprudence ensure people actually complied with all these incredibly nuanced rules?
They solved the problem of enforcement by fusing the physical with the metaphysical. The sources call this the dual sanction.
The dual sanction. Earthly and heavenly.
Yes. In most modern secular states, you only have material sanctions. The coercive power of the police, the fines, the prisons. But Islamic law is endowed with a spiritual sanction as well.
Meaning, God is the ultimate, inescapable surveillance camera.
Precisely. The bedrock belief in resurrection and the Day of Judgment means that a true believer will calculate their actions on a much longer timeline.
An eternal timeline.
Right. They will prefer to suffer a material loss in this temporary world rather than face divine wrath in the eternal hereafter.
There is a really powerful quote from the Prophet in the sources that perfectly illustrates the limits of human justice. Can you share that?
Yes. The Prophet, who was acting as the chief judge in Medina, once said to his followers, "Some of you are better pleaders, and I decide according to the facts submitted to me. If I decide in favor of any of you what is not his due, let him know that I award him only a part of the hellfire."
That is a staggering admission for a religious leader to make. Some of you are better pleaders. He is openly acknowledging that human courts, even a court presided over by a prophet, can be fooled.
It is a profound, incredibly pragmatic admission of the limitations of any judicial system.
Yeah.
A judge can only decide a case based on the evidence, the witnesses, and the arguments presented in front of them.
If you don't have the evidence, the judge can't help you.
Right. If someone is a smooth talker, if they hire a brilliant lawyer, or if they successfully conceal physical evidence, they might win their case. The judge's decision might be entirely correct, de jure, meaning it followed all the correct legal processes. But it could be entirely wrong, de facto, meaning it violates the absolute truth of what actually happened.
So if a judge gives me a piece of land because my forged documents looked really good, the state recognizes my ownership, I won the lawsuit.
Legally, it's yours.
But the Prophet is saying, congratulations, you just won a plot of hellfire. How does this shape the distinction between law and ethics? Because in modern society, we often conflate the two. We think if something is legal, it must be ethical.
Islamic jurisprudence forcefully separates the two. In the classical books of Fiqh, jurists will frequently write, "That is the rule of law, though the rule of piety requires just the contrary."
Wow, they literally write that into the law books.
Yes. The law is what the state can physically enforce based on material evidence. Ethics is what God will enforce based on absolute truth.
So there's a loophole in the law, but no loophole with God.
The state might award you the property, but if you know in your heart it doesn't belong to you, taking it is a spiritual crime. The dual sanction creates a massive psychological deterrent. You might beat the rap on earth, but you know you cannot beat the rap in the afterlife.
It's an incredible self-policing mechanism. And this dual sanction concept doesn't just apply to negative actions like not committing crimes or stealing land. It applies to positive duties to the state as well.
It does.
Which brings us to the ultimate example of this fusion from the texts, the concept of zakat.
Zakat is perhaps the most fascinating case study in how early Islam merged the spiritual and the political into a single cohesive system.
Because today, if you ask most people what zakat is, they will say it's charity or almsgiving.
But the historical and legal sources are adamant. Zakat is not mere charity. It is a mandatory state tax.
A tax.
Yes, it was the primary fiscal engine of the early Islamic state. It was an annual wealth tax levied on stagnant capital, agricultural produce, and commercial goods.
But, and this is where the genius of the system really shines, if you open a classical manual of Islamic law, You won't find the rules for zakat under the chapters on taxation or state administration.
No, you won't.
Where is it categorized?
It is invariably categorized under ibadat, which means acts of worship.
Acts of worship.
It is listed right alongside the rules for daily prayer, fasting during Ramadan, and performing the pilgrimage to Mecca.
That is a deliberate, brilliant psychological move. Think about the modern world. Nobody likes paying taxes.
Everyone hates it.
We hire entire industries of accountants to help us find loopholes to avoid paying the state. But the Quran constantly repeats the formula. Establish service of worship and pay the zakat, linking them in the exact same breath.
Inseparable.
In Islam, worshiping God isn't just about what you do with your soul in a mosque. It's about what you do with your bank account. Paying your taxes to the government is literally framed as an act of religious worship.
Exactly. What finance minister in history wouldn't love a population that believes dodging their taxes is a literal mortal sin that will condemn them to hell, and paying them guarantees eternal salvation?
It's the ultimate IRS.
It completely redefines the relationship between the citizen and the state's revenue service. You do your duty not because the taxman threatens to audit you, but because it is a spiritual obligation to purify your wealth.
But if you give the state that much religiously mandated money, corruption is almost inevitable.
Of course, absolute power corrupts.
Right. How did they prevent the caliph from just treating the treasury like a personal slush fund?
The state had incredibly strict, divinely mandated rules on how this money could be collected and used. First, the prophet ordained that zakat funds were religiously forbidden to him, his family, and his entire tribe.
Forbidden to the ruler himself.
They could not touch a single coin of it for their personal use.
Talk about an anti-corruption measure at the very top. The ruler, legally barring himself from the public treasury, sets a standard that has to trickle down.
Indeed. Furthermore, the government didn't have discretionary power over the budget.
Meaning they couldn't just spend it on whatever they wanted.
Right. The Quran explicitly lays out 8 constitutional categories for how zakat must be spent. The government could increase revenue through economic growth, but it couldn't deviate from these 8 expenditure categories.
And when you analyze them, these categories essentially outline a highly progressive, comprehensive welfare state functioning in the 7th century.
It's remarkable.
I want to break down these 8 categories deeply because looking at where a society spends its money tells you exactly what it values. Let's go through them.
The first 2 categories are the poor, the fuqara, and the needy, the masakin.
Okay, poverty relief.
This is the baseline. But it is crucial to note how early leaders interpreted this. The second caliph, Umar, ruled that the poor referred to impoverished members of the Muslim community, but the needy referred specifically to impoverished non-Muslims living within the Islamic State.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand this. The Muslims were paying a mandatory religious tax, an act of worship, and a designated portion of those funds was legally required to be used to support the poor of other religions.
Yes. The needy among the Jewish and Christian communities were direct beneficiaries of taxes paid solely by the Muslims.
That's astounding.
It is an acknowledgement that the state has a duty of care to all its vulnerable inhabitants, regardless of their theology. That is a remarkable level of social welfare for an era when most empires simply exploited minority populations.
Wow. Okay, what are the other categories?
The third category is those who work for the state revenues. The collectors, the accountants, the auditors.
So it funded the salaries of the civil service.
Exactly. The fourth category is described as those whose hearts are to be won.
That sounds intriguing. What does that mean in practice?
It was a sophisticated diplomatic and political fund. It was used to reconcile enemies, to provide financial support to new converts who had lost their livelihoods by joining the community, or even to pay off rival tribes to prevent them from attacking.
It sounds like a pragmatic mix of foreign aid, diplomatic lobbying, and a transition fund.
Exactly.
What's the fifth category?
The fifth is perhaps the most surprising.
Freeing the neck.
Freeing the neck.
This meant the state actually had a constitutional duty to use taxpayer money to emancipate slaves and ransom prisoners of war.
A state-funded abolitionist movement built right into the tax code.
Yes.
That is incredible. They didn't just say slavery's bad. They actively budgeted public funds to dismantle it by buying people's freedom.
They put their money where their mouth was.
And the sixth.
Aiding those who were heavily indebted. The state recognized that crushing debt destroys families and destabilizes society.
It does. The Caliph Umar utilized this category to organize a service of interest-free loans from the public treasury for people carrying unbearable financial burdens.
It was essentially state-sponsored bankruptcy protection.
Precisely.
And the seventh.
In the path of God, which jurists broadly interpreted as any charitable public work, but primarily it funded the military equipment and logistics necessary for the defense of the state.
National defense. Makes sense. And the final category.
The eighth is the wayfarer, the traveler.
Why would a state tax specifically target travelers?
Because travel in the ancient world was incredibly dangerous and vital for trade. This category funded hospitality for strangers, ensuring their physical well-being.
Like ancient motels?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
But it also scaled up to building infrastructure, constructing caravanserais, securing roads, digging wells along trade routes. It was for anyone traveling through the land, whether they were citizens or foreigners, Muslims or non-Muslims.
When you lay all 8 categories out and really look at their socioeconomic impact, it is literally a blueprint for a comprehensive welfare state.
It truly is.
You have public works and infrastructure, civil service salaries, universal poverty relief spanning across religions, debt forgiveness, diplomatic funds, abolition of slavery, and national defense. And it is all funded by a wealth tax that the citizens pay because they believe God is watching them.
It is a masterful synthesis of the spiritual and the intensely practical.
And this synthesis is exactly what allowed them to push the boundaries of legal theory. The early Muslims didn't just borrow laws from conquered territories, they invented entirely new legal paradigms that grew directly out of this worldview.
This brings us to a massive topic, our fifth major area of exploration: unprecedented legal innovations.
Yes, because the source material reveals that these ancient Islamic principles birthed legal concepts that we today typically assume were invented by modern Western Enlightenment thinkers.
We do assume that.
Let's start with the very idea of a science of law.
The texts make a bold claim here. They assert that the science of law, in its theoretical and methodological sense, simply did not exist in the world before Islam.
I have to push back on that.
Go ahead.
Law obviously existed. The Romans are famous for their laws. The Greeks, the Indians, the Chinese, they all had highly developed legal codes.
Yes, they had laws. But having a list of laws is not the same as having a science of jurisprudence.
Okay, clarify the difference.
The Romans had a massive compilation of edicts and judgments. But the systematic science of examining the philosophical roots of law, establishing a rigorous methodology for how legislation is derived, how texts are interpreted, and how case law is applied, that was pioneered by the Muslim jurist Imam al-Shafi'i.
Al-Shafi'i.
His groundbreaking book, Usul al-Fiqh, literally translates to the roots of law.
Yeah.
He was the first to strictly separate the foundational principles, the roots, from the general laws of the land, the branches.
So the Romans gave you a giant book of rules, but Al-Shafi'i gave you the algorithm for how to create a valid rule.
That is a perfect analogy.
And out of those roots grew a concept that is absolutely central to every modern criminal court today, but was apparently absent from earlier systems: the principle of intent.
Yes. The Prophet famously laid down the maxim: actions are to be judged only by intentions.
Only by
And
intentions.
this single sentence introduced a profound paradigm shift in human history. In many ancient legal systems, if you caused harm, you were punished based strictly on the outcome.
Regardless of what you meant to do.
Exactly. It was a system of strict liability. If your ox trampled my fence, or if you bumped into me and I fell on a sword, the outcome was the same. And the punishment was often the same, regardless of what was in your head.
Right. Ancient law didn't care about your psychology. It only cared about the physical damage.
But by making intent foundational, Islamic law recognized that the moral and legal weight of an action is inextricably tied to the internal psychological state of the actor. This is what we call mens rea, the guilty mind, in modern legal parlance.
It's the entire difference between a tragic accident and first-degree murder.
Yes, exactly.
If we are hunting together and my arrow ricochets and kills you, that's manslaughter. If I aim at your back, that's murder. Today, we take that distinction completely for granted. We base our entire justice system on it. But back then, injecting psychology into the courtroom was a revolutionary innovation.
It changed everything.
And it wasn't the only one. Let's pivot to something economic. When I hear the words social insurance, I think of modern actuaries, corporate policies, and guys in suits calculating risk. But the texts point to a document called the Constitution of Medina, drafted by the Prophet in 622 AD.
This is truly one of the most forward-thinking innovations. The Prophet laid down a system called Maikil.
Right here.
In the tribal society of Arabia, accidental homicides or the need to ransom a captured prisoner of war could require the payment of massive sums of blood money.
And if a normal working class person had to pay that out of pocket, they would be instantly bankrupted or sold into slavery to cover the debt.
Exactly. The financial burden would destroy the individual, so the Constitution mandated a system of mutual liability.
Mutual liability.
The treasury of the tribe, which was funded by small periodic contributions from all its members, would bear these catastrophic obligations. It was a literal pooling of risk.
What pool?
If the local tribe's funds weren't enough to cover the disaster, the parent tribe stepped in. And in the last resort, the central exchequer of the state would pay it.
That is literally an insurance premium. You pay a little bit regularly into a central pool so that if a catastrophe hits you, the community covers the costs.
It's the exact same concept.
But society didn't stay tribal forever. As the Islamic Empire grew into a massive, urbanized commercial powerhouse, how did this tribal insurance adapt?
It scaled beautifully. As society grew more complex, the Caliph Umar reorganized these insurance units. They moved beyond blood ties.
So they didn't have to be related anymore.
Right. Employees working in the same government department or soldiers in the same military cantonment became their own mutual insurance units. Later on, we see professional guilds, say, all the carpenters in a specific city, practicing this.
They created union dues that functioned as liability insurance.
Yes. And it eventually evolved into early forms of marine insurance for merchants.
Like for ships.
Yes. If you were a trader sending a ship across the Indian Ocean, you and other merchants would pool funds. If one ship sank in a storm, the pool would cover the merchant's loss, preventing ruin.
It's a localized self-help safety net that evolved into corporate insurance.
It is.
Now, while we are on the topic of commerce, we have to talk about commercial law and economics, because this is an area where early Islamic law offers a stark critique of our modern global system.
A very stark critique.
The sources bring up the strict Islamic prohibition of interest, but they contrast it with their unique solution for generating wealth.
Right. Islam strictly, unequivocally prohibits taking interest on loans usury.
Zero interest allowed?
Zero. The Quran actually characterizes charging interest as a declaration of war against God and his messenger. It views interest as inherently exploitative, allowing the rich to effortlessly drain the poor.
Wow, a declaration of war.
But the religion is definitely not anti-business. The Prophet himself was a merchant. So instead of interest, the law encourages profit and loss sharing.
Okay, profit and loss sharing.
The source text actually mentions the famous modern economist John Maynard Keynes, noting that his critiques of interest as the root of many modern social and economic ills closely echo this ancient Islamic principle.
So how does profit and loss sharing, which they call mudarba, actually work in contrast to a standard modern interest loan? Let's use a real-world example.
Let's compare them. In a traditional modern interest-based loan, you go to a bank for a small business loan. The bank gives you the money, and you agree to pay back the principal plus a fixed percentage of interest every month.
Right.
If your business thrives, the bank gets its fixed cut. But if a pandemic hits, or your store burns down, and your venture fails completely, the bank still demands its money. The risk is entirely on the borrower. The capitalist takes zero risk, but guarantees a profit.
Which often leads to the borrower losing their home or going bankrupt while the bank remains completely insulated.
Yes, exactly. In the Islamic system of profit and loss sharing, the capitalist and the entrepreneur enter a true partnership.
A partnership.
The capitalist provides the funding, and the entrepreneur provides the labor and expertise. They agree in advance to share the profits at a certain percentage.
Okay.
If the business makes $1 million, they both get rich. But, and this is the crucial part, if the venture fails through no fault or negligence of the entrepreneur, they must divide the losses. The capitalist loses their money, and the entrepreneur loses their time and effort.
It perfectly aligns the incentives. The lender can't just throw money at a bad idea and rely on predatory collection tactics to get it back.
No, they can't.
The lender actually has to care about the success of the business because they share the risk. It forces capital to be invested responsibly.
Exactly.
But wait, what about regular non-commercial loans? What if I'm not starting a business? What if my roof caves in and I just need money to fix it to survive the winter? No capitalist is going to enter a profit-sharing partnership to fix my roof.
Of course not.
Where do I get the money if interest is banned?
And that brings us full circle to the welfare state. This is exactly why Islam made it the duty of the state treasury to provide Card Hassan interest-free loans to citizens facing emergencies, funded by the zakat we discussed earlier.
Oh, it's all connected?
It is. The system relies on the state, or those mutual cooperative funds, to handle social emergencies without exploiting the desperation of the individual.
It is an incredibly cohesive economic ecosystem. Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground, from historical verification to economic theory. But there is one final legal innovation in the text that we have to discuss, and it deals with how the Islamic State interacted with the rest of the world. International law.
This is perhaps one of their most enduring yet overlooked contributions to human civilization.
Right.
Before Islam, international law wasn't really international, and it wasn't really law.
What do you mean? Didn't the Romans have the Jus Gentium, the law of nations?
They did, but the Jus Gentium was essentially Roman law applied to foreigners within Roman territory.
Yeah.
True international relations in antiquity were usually just political statecraft. Rules were reserved for resolving disputes with specific neighboring nations, often changing based entirely on political whims or power dynamics.
Like, we will sign a treaty and treat the Persians with respect because they have a massive army and can destroy us, but we'll slaughter or enslave these smaller nomadic tribes because they can't fight back.
Precisely. It was the law of the strong. But the Islamic legal code was the first to formalize international law, which they called siyar, as an actual independent binding branch of law.
Binding on everyone.
It was applied globally, regardless of geographical boundaries or the political strength of the opposing nation. It dealt meticulously with the rules of war, the conditions of peace, neutrality, treaties, and the rights of foreign citizens.
They didn't leave international relations to the mood swings of kings or generals. They bound it to the legal system itself.
Yes. They recognized that just as you need rules to govern individuals within a city to prevent chaos, you need a stable, universal legal framework to govern relations between nations in the world.
Right.
They established that treaties are legally binding contracts, not just temporary ceasefires. They set rules of engagement for armies that protected non-combatants, infrastructure, and the environment.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and zoom out. We have journeyed an incredibly long way.
We really have.
We started in pre-Islamic Arabia, a harsh, oral society that tracked time by blood feuds and recited disconnected poetry about battle days. And we watched how a theological concept, the finality of prophecy, forced them to invent a historical consciousness.
Out of thin air, basically.
They institutionalized historical objectivity. They developed the sciences of ruwaya and diraya to rigorously verify facts across centuries using background checks and the profound fear of divine judgment to prevent fabrication.
And they didn't stop at merely recording facts. They built a nuanced, flexible philosophy of law based on a rational analysis of good and evil.
The fivefold compass.
Yes. They created an economic and legal ecosystem that introduced concepts like the vital importance of intent, the pooling of risk in social insurance, the equitable sharing of economic risk, and the establishment of universal international law concepts that wouldn't appear in Western legal systems for many centuries.
And they did it all driven by this terrifyingly beautiful concept of the dual sanction. The idea that you aren't just answering to a judge in a physical courtroom, you are answering to the creator of the universe.
The ultimate accountability.
For you, listening to this today, it is incredibly easy to brush this off as just ancient history. A story about nomads and old books.
It's tempting to think that.
But look at our lives right now in the modern information age. We are absolutely bombarded every second of the day with data, news, and social media posts. In many ways, our Twitter feeds and news cycles look an awful lot like those disconnected pre-Islamic kabar.
They really do.
We are drowning in isolated fragments of information, yet we so often lack the rigorous chain of verification that these early scholars demanded. We share articles without reading past the headline. We retweet rumors without knowing the source.
The contrast really is striking. They lived in a world of profound information scarcity, and they built massive, meticulous systems to ensure the absolute accuracy of the little information they had.
And us.
We live in a world of overwhelming information abundance, and we have largely abandoned those systems in favor of speed and outrage.
Exactly. We lack the ethical grounding that these early historians believed was a matter of eternal salvation. They wouldn't dare share a false report out of fear of God. Today, algorithms actively promote and share false reports just to keep our attention on a screen.
It's a sobering thought.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. It is something not directly discussed in the historical texts we read today, but it is deeply inspired by them. I want you to imagine if today's global internet functioned with the exact same dual sanction as early Islamic law.
Imagine that.
What if every time you posted a piece of news, every time you signed a digital contract or left an anonymous, hateful comment on a forum, you believed with absolute, unwavering certainty that not only could a physical court hold you accountable, but the universe itself was keeping a permanent, unavoidable ledger of your true intent?
Everything recorded.
How differently would we all behave in the digital age if we believed our hidden motives, our silent biases, were the actual law of the land?
That changes everything.
Think about it. We will catch you on the next deep dive.